Welcome. My name is Kate Harmon. I'm the Director of Cross-Campus Engagement for the Lundquist Center for Entrepreneurship. And today on our Getting Ahead series, I'm very excited to have with us Bill Reinking. Bill is the president of the State Basketball Championships, which is the largest qualifier-based youth tournament company in the nation. So welcome, Bill. Thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'd like to start off by having you share just a broad overview of your professional career. I mean, we're going to focus this particular interview on one particular stage of your career when you founded the company Head2Head Sports. But to give our audience a broad kind of background on who you are, talk to us a little bit about, your college years. What did you end up studying in? What did you think your career was going to be like at that point? And just kind of briefly tell us some of the roles that you've had over your career.
You bet. Sure thing. So I was in Eugene from 1982 to 1986. Back in the day when the football team wasn't very good, we never went to a bowl game, although I wrote a zero. They call it the toilet bowl. 0-0 was the final score with Oregon State. So things have changed quite a bit in those days. I studied, I was in the business school. I got a Bachelor of Science in Finance, a minor in Computer Science, and enjoyed all 4 years. It was actually 4.5 years. I don't tell many people that. I graduated in December of '86, so it sounds like I graduated on time. But enjoyed everything the campus had to offer. And as I rolled into my spring term of senior year, fall term of that extra term in 1986, I discovered that there was a place called the Career Planning Placement Center, which back in those days was in Hendricks Hall. And it was as simple as to get an interview with a prospective employer. It was as simple as going upstairs and getting on a sign-up sheet with a pencil dangling from the envelope there in the sign-up sheet. And I began signing up for some interviews. First several didn't go so well. I'm not sure my socks even matched, and I'm sure that I butchered all of the responses that interviewees are supposed to come up with. But by the time I got my second, third, fourth interview under my belt, I started interviewing with a few companies within my major of finance. And one of those companies happened to be a branch of the U.S. Treasury Department, a company called or a branch called the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, to come on as a bank examiner. And it entailed the job would entail traveling around the United States and as a team with other examiners and going into banks and examining or auditing different departments. And I had a couple interviews there and made it all the way to get an offer, which was blessed to be in my hometown of Seattle, Washington. So I had a quick trip to Mexico, I think, after I graduated, and I started the next day. So that was in '97. And the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, acronym is the OCC. I was with them until 1993. Learned a ton. The traveling was certainly exciting, and we got to visit some areas in Alaska, for instance, or Western Montana that most people don't, unless they're on vacation, don't normally go to. And the job itself, the one thing that really stuck out to me was the ability or the experience I could gain in looking at the loan portfolios of the bank. So in looking at the commercial loans, and those loans ran a broad spectrum of small retailers all the way to large real estate companies. And when you examine those loans, you're looking for credit quality. Are the banks lending in a prudent manner, and do they have capital saved up to ward off any potential losses? And so as we would review the loans, we'd look for things like were the loans past due, are they performing, and if they weren't performing, are they being recognized as such by the bank to appropriately assess risk and put aside capital reserves. Along those lines, I reviewed hundreds, if not thousands, of company financial statements, including income statements, and learned then very well the importance of cash flow and the need for these businesses to generate cash flow in which to pay back the principal and interest coming from the bank. So the OCC was great. I was on the road perhaps 48 weeks a year. Ended up meeting my current wife now of 30 years while on assignment in Phoenix, Arizona. The savings and loan and national banks were really struggling in the early 90s. There was a recession, and Arizona was hit, in the Southwest was hit particularly hard. I was on assignment for 6 months, met Mary Ann, and ultimately got married, moved her up to Seattle, which is where I was stationed. And the 48 weeks a year on the road didn't go so well for someone that was brand new, A, to Washington, and B, to the rain and not knowing many folks. So I did leave the OCC for a year, went to a small bank in the area just so I could stay home and get off the road. And that led to my first entrepreneurial venture, and that was in the fantasy sports business, and started a company called Head2Head Sports in '94. We actually moved back to Arizona that year. My father-in-law, my wife's father was very ill at the time, and we knew we had a small window of time to spend with him, and thought what a great way to jump in and not only start my own business, but do it in the sunny and warm climates of Arizona. I had that company until 2007, sold it. I'll give you some more detail about how we got things started there. But to finish up the whole career path, we sold it in 2007. I stayed on for 3 years on a management contract on behalf of the buyer to help with that transition. And got to 2010, and that was about the time that we moved then to Bend, Oregon. The buyer thought, who in the world is this? They then subsequently, the private equity fund that purchased initially spun us off again. We had moved to Bend, raising our kids in a much smaller town. And they thought, who in the world is this guy that's collecting a salary and living in Bend, Oregon, when the office is in Arizona? So that contract came to an end in 2010. I thought, what in the world am I going to do next? Bend was just coming, and the whole nation was coming off of a pretty crazy recession. And Bend by itself is not an employment mecca. It's built around tourism, and the construction industry was non-existent. So I ended up working for a telecommunications company, commuting every Monday and Friday from Bend to Scottsdale, Arizona, all the while coming off of 15 years as an entrepreneur. It was tough. It was tough not working for myself. So, being able to make key decisions on a day-to-day basis and mulling those decisions at 2 a.m. and everything that comes along with being an entrepreneur. So the spirit was in a sense broken working for a larger corporation. And while toying with some ideas that never really panned out, as a business that was never supposed to be a business, which is my current business, state basketball championship, landed in our laps, and we got that up and going in 2012, and we sit here today, 2020, and that's the circle. So you really couldn't have more of an extreme, starting working at a steel desk at 7:30 in the morning, very buttoned down organization like the U.S. Treasury Department, to working in fantasy sports and now the basketball tournament business.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, because that does seem like an extraordinary leap from going to from the federal bank kind of role to founding your own online fantasy league with Head2Head Sports. So how did the idea for Head2Head come about? And I'm curious to know, when did you feel confident enough to start building the company and leave your role at the federal bank? Like, was it a short turnaround, or did you have to have a lot of things in place before you felt comfortable leaving your 9-to-5 job?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that entrepreneurs, when they get going, are often faced with, leaving the security of a job and jumping into something which quite frankly, and you would know, Kate, you would know the statistics better than I, as far as, you know, the failure rate of new businesses, startups and restaurants and things like that. So it was something that my wife and I definitely talked about. We knew that we needed to get back to Arizona for her family. And I had started researching the fantasy sports industry, gosh, back several years prior. So back in those days, we used fantasy football for instance, because it still remains by far the largest, most played fantasy sport. I was in a league with some buddies, which is typically how it was played. You know, you would go into a basement and your buddies would bring refreshments, and you'd have a draft board and you draft your players. And the commissioner, who either volunteered or was volunteered to keep all of the stats, had to communicate those things typically by snail mail, by U.S. mail. There was no internet in those days. Everything had to be generated, printed out, and put in an envelope and sent out to the 12 fantasy team owners in our league. And it was really gaining some traction. I started meeting more and more people who you'd be out or over at a friend's house, and some obscure play would happen on the TV where a tight end from the Tennessee Titans would score, and a guy would go crazy in the corner of the room, and he'd say, why are you so excited? And he'd say, I own that guy. He's on my team. And one thing led to another. It wasn't until I was on a flight from Seattle to San Francisco for work that I saw on the USA Today sports page a company based out of Boston, Massachusetts, at the no longer around, but called Replica Corporation, had commercialized the concept for the masses. And what they had done is create a salary cap game. So instead of you competing with your 11 buddies and if I own Dan Marino as a quarterback, no one else could own him, right? Well, in this commercialized product, it was done via salary cap. So you got $100 million to spend to draft 10 players, 9 players in a team defense. Each of those players was given a specific salary, with a superstar maybe costing as much as $20 million, and a lower rung bench player being far less. With the intent of the game was not to allow everyone just to load up on all the superstars, but you had to create your team wisely. And that was the light bulb moment for me. I then began researching more about the company, about the product. Again, no internet, so I would spend my lunch hours at whatever city I was in, at the local public library, and oftentimes after work, combing through what they called microfiche back in the day. And daily newspapers back then were put on film, and if you were lucky enough to get one of the non-broken microfiche machine, you could wind up the microfiche and scroll across and read an entire day's worth of newspaper, typically about a week or more late in the microfiche getting to the public library, but allowed me to see what Replica Corporation was doing around the country. They weren't just in USA Today, they were in some other newspapers as well. And I started researching the ins and outs of the industry, from the legalities to calling some newspapers as though I was a customer or player of that game, to try to fish around for how many people were playing. And the revenue model was you could play for around $30 or something like that, and you'd get a color game book and weekly newsletters coming to you in the mail. I have to say we more or less mimicked that product, and they weren't in every market. They stubbed their toe. I think they tried to get into the online space in about 1994, and had an 800, spent a lot of money on an 800 phone system to allow people to pick their players and things like that. I think it was very costly, and it didn't work so well, and they ultimately went out of business. So in 1994, we marched down to downtown Phoenix, got our articles of incorporation stamped, and away we went there.
Wow, that's amazing. And so, this was 1994, so just really at the early origins of the internet. How did you then think about, online and translating your business to the online forum? And what did that, look like as you started to think about online fantasy sports?
Sure. So it took a good, no, 94. So it took a good 5 years before we had an online presence. We needed to disseminate information in a timely manner to our 10,000 subscribers, which were gained by us going to major daily newspapers and kind of doing what Replica Corporation did. We 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 built it as a circulation driver for the newspapers, and we would generate a database. And when someone would enter or purchase our product, we would have them tell us, and then tell us whether they were daily subscribers. And those that weren't, we gave all the data to the newspapers, which then called on these folks to become subscribers. So we were given some very, very cheap space in newspapers around the country to get that off the ground. The biggest challenge, getting back to your question, Kate, about online presence, is we were using US mail, which was horribly slow, and especially when an envelope was going from Phoenix to somewhere in the East, it was the delay in delivery of the information really was limited our product and the enjoyment from the subscriber standpoint. So we then generated some software to send information via fax. I think we charged a whopping $5 a season if you wanted to get your information via fax, and that really became close to real time, same day anyway. When the football games ended on Sunday, we were able to send results. I guess it would be Tuesday morning after the Monday night game, and then folks would change their roster and call our phone agents. We had a couple dozen local ASU students that were manning a phone system that we had installed, and folks would trade out their players and have to pay a transaction fee to do that. Well, half the fun of playing is not only knowing who you have, but also who your weekly head-to-head opponent is. And that information will have to get delivered to you before Sunday. So that's when the faxing came into being, and we had fax machines whirling. You can remember all the screeching of an old school fax, and we had dozens of fax machines dialing through the night, and it just got so cumbersome. And then folks would say they didn't receive their fax, or maybe it was tied to a telephone number, and they would answer their phone and say, hello, hear the fax tone, and hang up, and then call our customer service angry at us because they weren't receiving their opponent for the coming week. So we got with the local, I guess at the time, the digital department of the Arizona Republic, which is the major daily newspaper here. At one time, they had over 1 million Sunday subscribers, to give you an idea how big newspapers were back in the day. Their web development team put a website together for us. It was very, very limited, but we used it for the first couple of years to distribute that information in real time. And that was a real big deal for us, right? We saved on stamps, we saved on the labor, we had our folding machines in our mailroom would break down and cause delays and everything going out. That problem was eliminated. The problem with the person picking up the telephone when they were supposed to be receiving a fax was eliminated. And now we were getting more into the current day. It was about 2 years though after that we then started getting into e-commerce and taking their transactions by phone, their trades, by the internet, their trades by the internet, and we were able to go from, I guess at the height, maybe 3 dozen ASU students. We were located in Tempe, so they'd ride their bike and they'd answer the phone. Those days went away. We went from about 36 maybe to 6 phone operators. Some people still preferred to, especially in the advent of the internet, they thought putting their credit card, via their keyboard was like putting their social security number out there, right? So there was still some old need for servicing the old school clients. And so I guess about 98, 99, we started taking credit cards. And there were hiccups. I think bandwidth was a problem early on, and there were some people still with dial-up modems. Cable modems weren't a thing yet, and so people then, it created a little bit different problem in that people weren't able to always access our website because their internet connection wasn't working, right? So it just evolved, and then coming to the mid 2000s, it was pretty well locked down and really polished, and it cut our expenses tremendously.
That's amazing. Well, I know early on you established a partnership with the NFL Players Association that essentially became the fantasy sports standard that continues to this day. Can you describe a little bit about how that particular partnership came about, and maybe discuss a little bit about what kind of impact that had on your business?
Sure. So initially, when we first launched in 1994, with a fantasy basketball game. And I just concluded watching the Last Dance series, so it's fresh on my mind. But Charles Barkley had just played in the NBA championship against Michael Jordan. We launched a game in Phoenix with Barkley being so popular. That was the made the most sense, is to launch in an area where they're passionate about their sports. And in so doing, we also secured a newspaper partnership in Orange County. And we wanted to make sure that we were pretty buttoned down, we weren't breaking any laws. So we hired an attorney to review what we were doing to make sure that we weren't infringing on any trademarks, or the big one, using a player's name for commercial purposes. And in hindsight, maybe I kind of wish that we hadn't hired an attorney, because they're good at thinking of all the scenarios and being, I guess, maybe glass half empty, and that's what they're paid to do. But they said, oh boy, you shouldn't go into California, because there are some precedents, some legal precedents and cases and results and things which could really come back to bite you, because you would be using Charles Barkley's name, for instance, in your game, and that could be viewed as illegal, and without his consent or paying some kind of royalty, that you could get a cease and desist order from the player itself, from the NBA and things. So we had worked so hard to get this partnership in Orange County that we called them and we said, hey, there's just too much risk here. In hindsight, we should have moved forward, because there's things that have happened along the way, but that scared us so much that our next product, which was NFL football and the fantasy around that, we thought, oh gosh, we better make sure that there's no exposure here. So we went straight to the NFL Players Association and said, hey, this is who we are. We've developed this game, and we would like to be able to use all the players' names, because they're listed in the newspaper and in our game book that we sell, all couple hundred of those offensive skill players. We would like to be able to use their name with your consent. The NFLPA had a marketing arm called Players Inc. And what Players Inc. did is they would charge us, say, a 7.5% of gross revenue, a fee to be able to use the players' names. And then all of that money and from other licensees and other products would go into a pool, and they would then distribute the monies to the individual players. And our initial partnership with NFLPA was done for solely legal reasons. It came with their logo, which went on everything that we had, really as a good housekeeping seal. Gave us a lot of credibility, and sponsors that were looking to join in what we're doing, utilize our database for selling their products. And it was about, first of all, 7.5% off of gross is a pretty big number, particularly for a company that still had a lot of startup costs and our margins were thin. So, but we said, hey, the legal risk is gone. Well, a couple of years later, by virtue of us supplying quarterly royalty reports to them, showing them what our sales were, they weren't dumb. They were getting these quarterly reports and thought, hey, maybe we should get into this business, right? So Sure enough, they came out with their own competing game. The larger online, at the time, the early Yahoo, CBS Sportsline was early on in the digital space. ESPN came up with their own game. We started seeing these major media players come in with their own distribution, their own means to advertise their games, to our detriment. So the getting licensed by the NFLPA, I don't think ultimately was a great thing for us. It kept us out of the courts, but fast forward to approximately 2008, MLBPA, Major League Baseball Players Association, were going after unlicensed operators, including ourselves. We got a cease and desist order from them. We hadn't approached them for a license quite yet because they weren't policing things. And still, the waters were pretty murky as to what their legal rights were, because all we were doing was putting the player's name and their statistics. We weren't using their likeness. So 2008, one of the other operators, after receiving a cease and desist order from Major League Baseball and the Players Association, they sued back. They had their ducks in a row, keep things UFO related. They sued back, and some back and forth, long trial. They ended up winning. The operator won and said that because the names and statistics were already in the public domain, that Major League Baseball did not have a right to force entities to be licensed. And that was a watershed moment for all of fantasy sports. And I guess if you used, on your packaging or on your website, you used a picture of Dan Marino or O.J. Simpson or Michael Irvin or Derek Jeter, you'd be using their likeness, right? And that would be a big no-no. But the players and their stats were in the public domain. And so would we have wilted early on through legal threat from an entity as big as NFLPA had we not gotten a license? Probably. But it was a good thing for the industry, and we were really super happy that that the courts ruled in the fantasy sports operators' favor. That's the whole gamut of start to finish with NFLPA. We sold in 2010. Head2Head Sports is still in operation, and I'm not sure they're licensed. I hope I'm not getting them in trouble. I don't know the answer to that.
That's a fascinating story. You were able to grow your company where you were doing multi-million dollars in sales per year through really strategic media partnerships. So I know that you had media partnerships with NASCAR.com, PGAtour.com, Fox TV, Knight Ridder, just to name a few. Describe to us a little bit about what your sales strategy was and how important was these media partnerships for the growth of Head2Head Sports.
Sure, they were critical. So early on, I mentioned that we went to the major daily newspapers. What that would entail is, so our growth strategy was simple, especially being a young entrepreneur. I thought we need to maximize number of subscribers. To be able to do that, we had to maximize our distribution channel. So we got real creative. We went to the major dailies, which included Knight Ridder and the Tribune newspapers, which, if you add up their circulations, probably at the time were 3/4 to 80% of all the readers across the country. Maybe not quite that high, but it was substantial. And we would negotiate rates. The print advertising in those days was very expensive. And they could command it because of the size of their readership, which now has shrunk, and some newspapers have filed for bankruptcy. But in those days, online advertising wasn't a thing. So we needed to get in the papers. And in our more successful cities that we were in, our more successful markets, they all had one thing in common. And that was a local, typically tribal or Native American casino in and around the outskirts of town. Here in Phoenix, it was the Gila River Casino. Kansas City, there was a casino operated by Harrah's. Black Hawk, Colorado, up out of Denver a little ways, had a whole series. of casinos up there. Seattle has some that with tribes nearby. There was a growing trend of casinos. So what we did is we approached the casinos and we said, hey, got a great deal for you. When our subscribers make trades every week on the players, it's very easy for them to call us, or when we got on the web to make their trades. Typical person was spending about $18 to $20 per week and swapping out a quarter. The salary cap made it so it was to move one person. It usually meant you had to move 5 or 6 on your team. Well, we'd be happy to take your credit card and charge you the $3 per trade or $18 total. We did have money-saving trade packages, 20 for $40 and that kind of thing. We'll be happy to take that from the comfort of your own living room. Or if you prefer, you can make all those trades for free by taking a specially marked trade certificate that we would mail to the customers at the beginning of the season. Write down the ID players of the names you're dropping, IDs players of the names you're adding, and take it to the local casino. And in the back, typically way back past the slot machines and card tables, was a box, and you drop your trades in the box and everything's free. Well, casinos had a formula, which to this day I still don't know exactly what it is. It's proprietary, but for every customer through their doors, they spend X number dollars gaming, more than likely losing on average, right? So some of these casinos, we were getting more than 1,500 people a week going through those doors. We utilized that partnership to pay for full-page color ads in Sunday daily newspapers, which in bigger markets like Phoenix would cost, just one ad probably costs about $80,000. Give you a sense of 60 to 80,000. And weekdays, black and white, maybe 20 to 30,000. There's no way we weren't funded that way. So we were creative in generating the foot traffic and the casino gaming revenue for the casinos, and then they paid for the advertisements, and it was, as they say, it was a win-win. I don't recall the first part of the growth strategy. That was really it. It really drove us, got us into the 10 to 15,000 customers nationwide, all paying approximately, in those days, if including the trades, it was maybe $130, and that's just for one sport. We also had a fantasy baseball game, fantasy basketball game, and our sales growth in the early 2000s started to be stunted a bit by as I mentioned, all those media players that were coming in and with their own distribution channels. And they knew from surveys that were done by the Fantasy Sports Gaming Association, it was a legitimate association. We'd meet once a year in Las Vegas, and we hired survey companies to come back and tell us that it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. As high I remember as when I was still there, 20 billion plus. And the media players knew that this was a wave. They jumped in. Our sales really started to slow down as a result, and it just became harder to generate new subscribers. That's when you asked about the NASCAR.com and PGA-Tour.com. They were seeing the benefits of having their own subscribers play a fantasy game or being offered a fantasy game when they were on their own digital platforms. And so what we did is we created a white label fantasy game, meaning it looked and felt as though it was PGA-Tour.com and NASCAR.com's games. They didn't want anything to do with operating the game. They didn't know, they weren't in that space, right, of developing it. So we simply reskinned our football, baseball, basketball games for NASCAR racing and golf. And so we thought this was a way to make some ancillary revenue to offset some of the subscriber, the decrease in growth that we were seeing there.
That makes sense. Interesting, yeah. Really fascinating. What would you, if you look back at that time period, what would you describe as sort of your best memory or greatest success with Head2Head Sports? And on the alternate side, what were the greatest challenges? Was it, these competitors coming into your space, or were there other sort of challenges as you're trying to build the company?
Yeah, sure. So successes, when you're brand new, first time entrepreneur, you never know what's going to happen. I always had banking to fall back on. So when you asked about the risk of leaving the Treasury Department and starting a business that a lot of people, including my father-in-law, when he heard that I was getting into fantasy sports, he thought maybe it was some risque type industry that, that people in back alleys might be involved with. So gosh, I didn't know if this thing was going to take off or not. I did have a role model in this replica corporation that had gotten it off the ground. So I thought, why not me? And so the successes at the beginning are few and far between, but my first memory was the fantasy basketball game here locally. It was played in the Tribune newspaper group. So Mesa, Tempe, Scottsdale, Chandler, Gilbert all had, they were part of the local Tribune company. We ran advertisements in those. And as we got up to the sign-up deadline, which is typically a couple days before the NBA season would tip off, we had a P.O. box in which people could, it was a mail-in deal only with checks. You remember, there's no e-commerce, no internet to rely on. So we had a local P.O. box at the Scottsdale post office, and my gosh, the subscriptions were trickling in. I had meetings with the circulation department at the Tribune and had more or less committed or guaranteed or promised. I said, this is a no-brainer. You're going to get several hundred people playing this game. If you convert just a few of those to everyday subscribers for the next 10, 20 years, you guys can do the math. And they had some budget in which to the circulation department to kind of give away for marketing promotions like this. And it was slow. It was slow, to say the least. I think we were hoping for around 300 or 400 subscriptions from this fantasy basketball promotion. And a day or two before the deadline, I think we had 10 or 11. And the last day in which of the deadline, I went in. The mail typically got there around 10 a.m. I went in just to be safe. I went in about 10:30, slowly opened the box, and there was one piece of mail. I thought, oh boy, okay, banking, here we go. And then I felt bad because I was going to have to break it to the Tribune that the promotion was not a success. As I grabbed the envelope, there was a little note in there, a little yellow note that said, please come to the front desk. And I thought, what is this? And I go and I wait in line and I hand them the note. And so they said, oh, it's you. And they came back with a couple, like a Santa sack full of mail. And I thought, gosh, there's hundreds in there. I think there were 600 total pieces of mail in the two bags. And I sat on the curb outside and I thought, maybe this is going to be a thing. So small success early on. Young entrepreneurs don't know their small successes until they experience them. I guess the biggest success we probably had was getting some fantasy football promotions up with the casinos, and they were also promoted with the casinos' TV partners. So the casinos were spending some of their media buys with the TVs to promote the game, and said, look at the Arizona Republic, for instance. Just seeing the game being advertised over and over and over on TV was a neat thing. So I guess coming to mind, those were the two successes, the ultimate success being the sale of the company in 2007. The hurdles, I had written down a few items. There were a lot. The distribution of information pre-internet was obviously a biggie. Investing in software to get the fax machines up and going. Those were certainly some hurdles, but being a first-time entrepreneur, I recall I'd hired just a couple people to help, and one of the gentlemen was a retired man from New York City that had sold an office supply store. His name was Bernie, and Bernie, about 2-3 weeks in, we had just given our employees the first paychecks. It was about maybe a week later. He said, "Hey, what are you doing with all those payroll tax reports that you're supposed to be sending to the state?" And I said, "What? Payroll tax reports?" And he says, "Oh boy, give them to me." He'd done them for years, and he taught me how to do things that I'd never dreamed of being related with running a business. Right, so there were constant learning opportunities like that. Managing people, hiring people, learning the do's and don'ts of the interviewer process. Those were some major challenges. Obviously, when the multimedia companies came in, it stunted our growth. We had to get very, very creative because we really were kind of just having our own way there and being one of the early pioneers in fantasy sports. Everything we did, we touched, turned to gold, more or less. Competition, there were some folks that looked at what we were doing. They were jumping in the space. So we had to be more aggressive, going to the major daily newspapers. I recall flying to Philadelphia and meeting with the Observer, I believe was the name. And as I was coming out, a competitor was going in to pitch. And I thought, this is the time we better up our game. So I added a couple salespeople and tried to get to the major daily newspapers a little more quickly than our competitors would be able to.
Wow, that's great stories. Well, as you mentioned, you sold the company in 2007 to a private equity firm, and you stayed on there for 3 years. In 2012, you arrived at your next startup, state basketball championship. So talk to us a little bit about how that opportunity came about, and what is your sort of growth strategy, and how you've been able to take that company over the last 8 years and really expand it into a multi-state tournament company.
Right. Yeah. So this one, I talked about the light bulb moment with the fantasy company when I saw the advertisement from Replica Corporation. There wasn't exactly a light bulb moment with state basketball championship. Nonetheless, we had never really thought of it being a business. My youngest son had just, about 2011, he had just finished playing for Ben South Little League All-Stars, and they won district, and they went on and won their state title. First team from Bend, Oregon to ever do so. And from there, they went to play regionally and played on ESPN. It was a great experience. All along the way, we talked to families of other folks that were having to live in a motel most of the summer, following their 12-year-old kid around, in the heat and being away from home. But saw the excitement of their journey along the way, knowing that it was kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity. And it was at the state tournament, which was actually held in Bend, that we thought, I'm coaching my youngest son's youth basketball team. Wouldn't that be neat? Like Pop Warner for football or Little League for baseball. Wouldn't that be neat if there was a state championship for youth basketball? And because in Oregon, there certainly wasn't anything like that. Your only opportunity to play outside your town was to travel to Eugene or Portland. And if you happen to win the tournament that weekend, you get the 99-cent trophy and a pat on the back. No bigger stakes, shall we say. And I was a coach, and coaches have egos. They all think they're the next Phil Jackson, and they're as competitive. And in some coaches' case, and not in a good way, they're more competitive than their kids. And I started talking to some other coaches, and they thought this would be a great idea. We would come and play if you put something like this together. So we then thought, I told my wife, let's hold a tournament, and let's hold it here in Central Oregon, which is a destination hotspot. Even in March, people are wanting to get out of the valley in the rain and things. And we were hoping to get, we didn't know, 24 teams maybe to come through the, travel over the pass. And it was for boys and girls, grades 5th through 8th. And we partnered with some, we didn't run the tournaments, but we approached other weekend tournament operators around the state and said, hey, we'd love to add excitement to your event by asking you to be a qualifier for the state tournament. And we'll award these golden ticket invites to the teams that finish 1st or 2nd. They'll come and play at state. And they didn't cost them anything. And in fact, today, a lot of them see the value in being a qualifier, because a lot of teams, when they go to spend money to enter a tournament, it's great if they're a qualifier because they want to play at state. And we got to about 60 teams, somewhere in that range. It was going to be held in March of 2013. And, my wife said, this is all great and things, but we have no idea how to run a tournament. What's the first thing we do? And I thought, you're right. What should we do? She said, shut down registration. We don't need to, you're spending all your time looking for more gyms because more teams want to play. Well, I said, okay, with a wink. And we ended up with 106 teams coming from Brookings and Pendleton and Medford, Astoria, and of course, Greater Portland and Salem and Eugene, and the hometown teams in Bend. We managed through it. I can't say it was the easiest thing we've ever done. But when we recapped the financials, we thought, this never gonna, be the greatest business in the world economically, but we think there's a business here. And there's different revenue line items: entry fee, spectator admission, which is your gate, apparel sales, hotel commissions, those kind of things. And so we got through that. It wasn't too much longer that we realized we're not a basketball business, because we then had incorporated as state basketball championship. We were really in the event business, dabbling in basketball. And we recognized that we needed to get help on the event side of things and get people to travel with us. And here we are, 2020. We were in 9 states this year with our eyes set on additional states. Our largest in Spokane, Washington would have been the 7th annual. I say would have been because COVID canceled our tournament 24 hours before it was to have started. That was going to have 518 teams. Hotels in Greater Spokane were all booked all the way to the Idaho Panhandle, and we were playing on 52 courts all throughout the region. And to generate and to run an event of that size is a monumental task. And so we've added full-time staff for that. And I think we're in a position where we can continue to scale it, much like we did the fantasy company. Mm-hmm.
That's great to hear. My last question to you, given your background and having 2 successful startups under your belt now, as you look back at those experiences, any kind of advice or best practices you can recommend to students who might want to follow a similar career path as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, well, yes, definitely. So a lot of people have the mindset that they want to become an entrepreneur, and that's great. And our nation is really founded on the entrepreneurial spirit, and small business, drives a much greater part of the economy than large business. What I learned, and I've always liked to, as opposed to giving advice, I like to share experience because I've lived those things, right? Don't search too hard for that product. Give it time. I think sometimes the harder you search, the more difficult and frustrating the process could be. The 2 ventures that I started, just one was the light bulb moment, and the other was not supposed to be a business that turned into it because we were passionate about youth basketball. Those ideas will come when you least expect it. It doesn't, if someone is getting an entrepreneurial degree, that they graduate in June, to get business up and running in September is probably not realistic. There's some folks that I'm sure have been researching and maybe starting something even during their college days, and that's great. But I think that would be more the exception than the rule. I I found that getting into a position within my major straight out of school, which was being a bank examiner, and learning about cash flow and having to meet debt service needs. Not that a young entrepreneur is going to go out and get a bank loan necessarily, but if you get a loan from a family or member or a friend, that loan's going to need to be repaid. The biggest piece of shared experience that I can give is to know your cash flow position at all times, every day. I've been an entrepreneur now since '94, and every day I know our cash position. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good, but you need to know where you are before you spend money and commit to purchasing things that will help you grow. And that money can be burned through very, very quickly. And to not have a handle on it can really put you in some dire straits, especially if your business doesn't work out. So, and take your sales, I guess your sales forecast, and cut it by half. What happens if you're only half as successful coming out of the gate than you think? And that's probably, again, more realistic than not. What does that do to your cash? Have different scenarios. Say, hey, if it takes longer for my sales to get going, how, and it can be exciting and it can be addictive when you first start getting those sales and seeing that your product is being accepted by the marketplace. But a lot of times it's much slower than you anticipate. So with a slower rollout, where are you in 1 month? Where are you in 6 months? Do I need to get some more capital? Do I need to work longer hours? Whatever it is, always do it with cash flow in mind.
Excellent.
Yeah, the last thing is, hey, follow your dreams, go all in. We know that there's going to be failure along the way, but with failure, you can learn and apply what you learn to future endeavors. Just block out the naysayers. I had naysayers when I started the fantasy company. I had naysayers, mostly close friends and family, but block them out and just go for it, man. Just do it.
That's great. Perfect. Bill Reinking is the president of the state basketball championship. Thank you so much for joining us today, Bill.
You bet. Good luck to all of your students, and I hope you guys get back in the classroom setting sooner than later.
Thank you. Have a great day.